Hi, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about wide area networks, at least to introduce the concept, and we'll have a lot more videos to follow. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first of all, what is a WAN, wide area network? Well, it's a telecommunications or computer network that is used to used for connectivity over a relatively large geographical area. We're going to talk more about what exactly that means in just a moment. But it's used to transmit data between local area networks and other types of devices and networks over remote distances. So we'll kind of gather this concept more and more as we go. Matter of fact, the internet, sometimes some people even consider the internet as a wide area network. Okay, so as far as the layers go, where do WANs operate? Well, they operate at layer 2, and this is where in later videos, and a little bit in this video, but more in following videos, we'll talk about some protocols and technologies, HDLC, PPP, frame relay, Ethernet, WANs, really metropolitan Ethernet, for example, and a few other things. And of course, it involves the physical layer. A lot of that today is fiber optics and some wireless and that sort of thing. Okay, so as far as the standards bodies that control these layer 1 and layer 2 standards, we have TIA, EIA, ISO, and IEEE. So remember, IETF and RFCs, the TCP/IP protocol suite, that really sits on top of layer 1 and layer 2, starting at layer 3. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about my journey and seeing wide area networks kind of evolve over the years. And a lot of this starts with the telephone network. So in a telephone network, we have we traditionally, or kind of how it started out, the public switch telephone network was an analog system, and our computers are digital. So we use these things called modems to modulate and demodulate the signal. Basically, convert the signal from a digital signal to an analog signal so it could be sent over the public switch telephone network. Now, a lot of the public switch telephone network today is a digital network. So a lot of this analog communications that happen between the modem and the cloud here in this picture, that's the only place where the analog transition happened and would be converted back to digital once it reached the Pstn cloud. But let's talk a little bit about, let me show you some old modems. In fact, this is my first modem here. I had an old, this isn't an exact picture of it, but I had one like this, a coupler modem, which was an Anderson-Jacobson modem. Talk more about that in a moment. But this is how we actually connected. We picked up the receiver, dialed the number, and when you got the connection, you'd put that phone into the coupler. And then we got a little bit fancier, and we had boxes that replaced these things. You can see the connection to the telco. So your RJ11 cable from your phone line would go in here to your phone connection. And then you had a serial connection, RS-232 connection, that went to the back of your computer. Eventually, then that got replaced by an interface card. Okay, but what I want to do is talk a little bit about what I've seen in my experience of wide area networks, and really just kind of share that with you. So start out with a public switch telephone network, PSTN, sometimes also known as POTS, plain old telephone system. And what we'd have here is we'd have a modem, okay? And connected to the modem would be your computer. And then we'd be connecting to some kind of computer over here. Back in the old days, actually, I was connecting to a mainframe. And I mentioned my Anderson-Jacobson modem, coupler modem. It actually was a 300 baud modem. And you think of that as about 300 bits per second. That's about what somebody can almost type, or a lot of people can actually type faster than that. That's how fast the information or how slow the information was transmitted over the network, over the public switch telephone network. But this was basically here an analog signal and computers, as we mentioned earlier, talk digitally. And the modem is what converted it from digital to analog and coming back the other way, analog to digital. Now, at one time, years ago, the public switch telephone network was an analog network, but it was converted internally to a digital network and based on something called T1 lines. We'll talk more about T1 and time division multiplexing in that in a little video. I'll give you more about that a little later. But that was the early days of how to remotely connect to devices. And if you want some really old history on this, even prior to my days, and I'm talking here probably the late 1970s into the early 1980s, this is what I was using. And even into, let's say, pretty much the 1990s. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the history of the internet and how it actually translated information, starting with the days of the ARPANET, a book I would recommend is called Where Wizards Stay Up Late. And so I think Lyons is the author. Okay, but let's continue on this journey a little bit. So let's see, there we go. All right. So that was pretty slow, the public switch telephone network. Matter of fact, you could get up, started out about 300 bits per second. And then the fastest you could really go was theoretically 56K bits per second, 56,000 bits per second. But that was a theoretical bandwidth. So really what it was close to was about 53,000 bits per second. So we wanted to move a little faster than that. Oops, let me get back there we go. Let me just erase that. There we go. All right, so over the public switch telephone network, because most of it was a digital network. So another way that you could connect that was something using called ISDN, and we'll talk more about that in the later videos as well. Some people jokingly call that I still don't know, or it still does nothing. But this was really a digital network. So I would have my computer at home, and the place I was working, which was at the time Tandem Computers, they set me up with an ISDN, and I can actually had about 128,000 bits per second over this. Actually a little bit more, close to 144,000 bits per second, but this was all digital. And at the time, that seemed incredibly fast, okay? And really, modems and ISDN were your only choices for a long time until we got into broadband with DSL and cable. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But let me talk a little bit about how businesses were connecting to the internet. Oh, there we go. All right. So as far as businesses were going, so we had different types of providers here that providing wide area network connectivity, and you might have your headquarters building here, and you might have some branch offices around the United States, around the world, whatever. One way to connect was to use these things called leased lines. So let's say we wanted everybody to connect to headquarters. Maybe we even wanted these two to connect. Okay, so through some kind of provider here, we would have some sort of leased lines. And we'll talk more about these, but you might have heard like T1s. Could be fragmented T1s, or use T1s, T3s. We also call these DS3s and things like that. And I'll talk more about that in a later video as well. But we use some kind of, going through a provider, a telecom provider, you'd have to pay for these leased lines. And what you were paying for was both the speed and the distance. And you're paying for every leased line. And this could get quite expensive. just end to end, depending how far this was the data was being transmitted. It could be quite, several $1,000s per month for each line. And we're talking probably 1.5 megabits per second or less. A T1 line is 1.544 megabits per second. Okay, and that was considered back in the 80s and into the 1990s fairly fast. So let's actually talk a little bit more about this. So let me kind of clear that. Let me talk a little bit about, okay. So matter of fact, Cabrillo's connection, when Cabrillo College, so here we have Cabrillo. I remember our first connection to our service provider, or the internet. Just this connection by itself, was a T1 line. So T1 line was, again, 1.544 megabits per second. And on the average, we paid a little less because we got we paid a lot less because we got a certain educational discount. But at the time, a T1 line to the internet was about $1,500 a month. Think of that, $1,500 a month for 1.5 megabits per second. Okay. Seems ridiculous today. All right, let's continue with this. So I talked about, there we go, having these different leased lines. So I had headquarters here and different branch offices here. So, going into, and this again, probably, I'm not sure exactly when it started, but in my lifetime, this was definitely 1980s, 1990s, and into the early 2000s. Talked about having these leased line circuits, okay, through a provider. And they got quite expensive because you're paying for, again, speed and distance for each leased line. So what transpired was another kind of technology. Let me remove that there, okay? So where we had, for example, something called frame relay. Frame relay is known as a non-broadcast NBMS, non-broadcast multi-access network. So we'd have a provider here that provided the frame relay connection. And we'll talk more about this in a later video, but all you had to do was connect to the provider. So we had a connection here, and as long as your branch offices could connect to the provider, they could all be interconnected using frame relay. So all you had to pay for, not all you had to pay for, but one of the things you had to pay for was your access circuit here. So this would be an access circuit, which was basically a leased line between you and the frame relay provider. And you had to do the same thing for each of your branch offices in this case. So first of all, you had to pay for some kind of get to the frame relay cloud, this frame relay provider. Then your frame relay provider would actually provide these things called virtual circuits. And they would actually make the connection for you internally. Now you paid for these virtual circuits. And this actual topology I have here that's showing is that all of our branch offices, let's say branch 1, branch 2, and branch 3, are all connected to our headquarters. This was what's known as a hub and spoke topology. And the reason why this was, why a lot of businesses like to do this, was that you're only paying for these circuits. So you're only paying for 1, 2, 3 circuits. And if branch 1 wanted to talk to branch 3, that traffic actually had to go through the headquarters and back out. So from the spokes to the hub and out to a spoke again. So this was a preferred topology, the hub and spoke, over something else. Let me kind of quickly show you what else was a possibility. Let me get my cursor back. There we go. So let me clear this out. Another frame relay topology you could use. And again, we're going to be talking more about this in a later video. But if I had the headquarters here and the branch offices here, you could do what was known as a full mesh. So everybody connected to everybody. Okay. But again, you're paying for each one of these circuits. Okay. So to keep costs down, got away from the lot of enterprises would get away from this full mesh where everybody was directly connected, and again, just hub spoke where the spokes were connected to the hub. Okay, we'll be talking more about that a little later. But as far as speeds go, this was relatively slow. Again, you're talking, really note speeds not greater than 4 megabits. So still relatively, well, at the time was considered, fairly fast for what we were trying to do, but it was still expensive and still fairly slow. Okay, so what changed? So here you have these branch offices, maybe your headquarters here. Frame relay was slow and it was expensive. So one of the things that came about was broadband, including things like DSL and cable modems. Okay. So all of a sudden, DSL was a possibility. DSL over the public switch telephone network or cable over your provider. But at least DSL was, wherever you had a telephone connection, you could probably get DSL in most cases. So frame relay was quickly replaced by using these broadband, especially DSL in a lot of places at first. I remember a certain county office of education, county office of education that we had, and then they had all these schools out here, different high schools and middle schools and elementary schools. And they saved a lot of money by dumping frame relay and going with DSL, just like you do at home today. And now we're talking about much faster speeds as well. We're talking, into the megabits, even in the early days. Okay, so that was DSL and broadband. So where are we kind of headed today with a lot of this stuff? Okay, so a lot of this today, a lot of, we still have DSL and cable. Okay, and we'll talk more about, especially for remote access and home access and even wireless and satellite access. But some of the other things that we're seeing are things like Metro Ethernet. So now what you're finding is that companies can communicate with each other, or here we got headquarters and our branch offices, over Metro Ethernet. So we're talking inside here, this is a fiber network, fiber optic network, and we're talking now into the gigabits. So I mentioned Cabrillo's connection, which was in the early days a T1 line at 1.544 megabits. That's a 4 there, sorry. 1.54 megabits per second. Now we're talking multiple 10 gigabits per second. That's a G there, sorry about that. 10 gigabits per second that we're connecting to over Metro Ethernet. Really just similar to the same Ethernet that you have at home. Some other technologies that are coming that are happening inside here, we're doing things today. We're doing things like MPLS. Providers are using MPLS, VPNs. There's a big push right now, or one of the really big movements is something called SD-WAN. I'm going to be talking about all of these in later videos, at least introducing these. And why is all these kinds of things happening inside our provider transport network? Reasons for security, optimization, manageability, efficiency, reduced costs, less complexity. So quality of service, all of this stuff. So Still a lot of stuff is happening in the wide area networks. All right, so we're going to be talking a lot more about this stuff in later videos. Let me kind of clear this out here. So just wanted to kind of show you the evolution of this kind of thing that's been happening over the years. And again, we'll be talking much more about this in later videos. Okay. All right, so that's just a brief introduction into what is a wide area network, and a lot more to follow.